The morning Alberta Thatcher found a man bleeding out on her front porch. She had already decided the day could not possibly get any worse. She had been wrong about that before, but never quite so dramatically as she was about to be. It was the spring of 1874, and the town of Red Rock Crossing, nestled in the sun-cracked flats of southeastern New Mexico territory, was the kind of place that chewed up the soft-hearted and spat them into the dust. Alberta was not soft-hearted, not anymore. She had buried a husband 2 winters past, watched the bank in Santa Fe send a man with cold eyes, and a colder contract to inform her that the debts her late husband Gerald had accumulated were her inheritance now, and she had still managed to keep the small horse ranch he had left her in a state of functioning ruin. She was 26 years old, 5'4" of calloused hands and stubborn jaw, with dark copper hair she kept braided down her back, and green eyes the color of creek water after rain. She had learned not to need anyone, and she had been doing a fine job of proving it until that particular Tuesday in April when Calvin Rourke appeared on her porch boards. He was face down at first. She very nearly stepped over him to get to the water pump, because she had learned not to trust strangers lying still in unexpected places. But then he groaned, and there was something in the quality of that groan that was less performance and more genuine agony, and Alberta crouched beside him and turned him over. He was perhaps 28 or 29, lean through the face and broad through the shoulders, with dark hair matted with dried blood on his left temple, and a jaw that had not seen a razor in 4 or 5 days. He wore trail clothes, worn but not filthy, and at his hip sat a holster that had seen hard use. He was not dead, which was something, but the wound along his left side, where his shirt had been torn and soaked through, suggested he had been making his way toward that condition with some commitment. Alberta was practical. She dragged him inside, which took considerable effort and produced a loud string of words from her that would have scandalized the women of the First Presbyterian congregation in town. She got him onto the narrow bed in the back room she used as a storeroom, cut away his shirt with her sewing shears, and examined the wound. It was a knife wound, not a bullet, which she considered fortunate. She had dealt with a bullet wound exactly once, and the memory of digging lead out of old Tom Baxter's shoulder by lamplight in this very room was not one she revisited for pleasure. The knife had gone along the ribs, deep enough to matter but not so deep as to have hit anything vital as far as she could determine. She cleaned it with whiskey from the bottle she kept for medicinal purposes and a little for cold nights, and she stitched it with the same firm hand she used on harness leather. He came fully awake during the stitching, which said something for his constitution because she had not been gentle. He grabbed her wrist and she met his eyes, which were dark brown and currently full of pain and defensive fury in equal measure. "Hold still," she said, in the same tone she used on spooked horses. He held still. His grip on her wrist loosened but did not release entirely for another few minutes until she tied off the last stitch and sat back. "You are on my property," she told him flatly. "Alberta Thatcher. This is the Thatcher Ranch. You were bleeding on my porch." He looked at the ceiling for a moment, breathing carefully. "Calvin Rourke," he said. His voice was low and roughened either by pain or by nature. "I apologize for the inconvenience." "Who cut you?" A pause. "A man who disagreed with me about something." "About what?" "About whether I was going to let him take a horse that was not his." Alberta studied him. She knew how to read men who were lying and men who were telling the truth that happened to sound implausible. Calvin Rourke appeared to be doing the latter. "Whose horse?" "Woman about 12 miles north of here. Widow woman with 2 small boys. Man was fixing to take her only remaining draft horse, said she owed him money for work he never did." "I was passing through." He paused to breathe again, his jaw tight with the effort of keeping his voice steady. "I disagreed with the arrangement." Alberta looked at him for a long moment. "Her name Dolores Munez." Something shifted in his expression. "That is right. I know her. She does have 2 small boys." Alberta stood, rinsed her hands in the basin. "You are going to stay in that bed for at least 3 days, or I will drag you back to the porch and let the vultures decide. I do not plan to be any trouble to you." "You are already trouble to me," she said, moving to the doorway. "I will bring you water and something to eat. Do not touch anything." She cooked him a simple meal of salt pork and cornbread, and brought it with a tin cup of water, and she left him to it with minimal ceremony. She had horses to see to and fencing on the east pasture that needed her attention, and at least 40 other things that commanded her time, and she directed her focus toward all of them with the particular ferocity of a woman trying not to think about the injured stranger in her back room. Over those first 3 days, she learned Calvin Rourke in pieces, the way you learn a country by traveling it slowly. He was from Texas originally, a ranch southeast of San Antonio, the second of 4 sons to a cattle family that had done well before the war and recovered imperfectly afterward. He had ridden with cattle drives at 18, worked for various outfits across Texas and New Mexico and Arizona territory for 10 years, and had recently been employed by a ranching outfit in Doña Ana County that had dissolved when the owner died and the estate went to a nephew in Philadelphia who had never sat a horse in his life and wanted nothing to do with the territory. He was methodical in the way he spoke, never wasting words, but not cold with them either. When Alberta came in to check his wound on the second evening and found him sitting up against the wall reading the 3-year-old newspaper she had left in the room for want of anything better to offer, she found herself answering his question about the ranch before she had consciously decided to. "It was my husband's originally," she said, checking the stitches with clean hands. "Gerald Thatcher. He had 40 horses when he died. I have 19 now and I am building it back. What happened to the others? Some I sold to pay debts. Some I lost to a fever that came through the winter of 72. I have been breeding up from what remained." She sat back, satisfied with the wound. "I break them myself. I sell to the army post at Fort Selden and to ranchers up and down the valley." He watched her with those dark brown eyes. "That is a considerable operation for one person." "I manage," she said in a tone that closed the subject. He nodded, accepting that. "You are good at this," he said, gesturing briefly at his side. "My mother was a physician's daughter. She taught me what she knew." Alberta stood. "You can probably move around tomorrow if you are careful. Do not do anything foolish." "I rarely do anything foolish," he said. She looked at him with the particular skepticism of a woman who had found him bleeding on her porch. He had the grace to almost smile at that. By the 4th day he was up and moving, and by the 5th he had walked himself out to her corral fence without being invited and stood watching her work a young roan, gelding she had been training for the past 6 weeks. She was aware of his presence at the fence, but she did not stop, because the horse needed her full attention, and because she had a principle about not interrupting good work for social niceties. When she was finished and the roan was cooled and fed and back in his stall, she came to the fence and leaned on it beside him in the long amber light of late afternoon. "You should probably be on your way," she said, though she said it without particular force. "I should," he agreed. "I would like to work for my keep first if you will have me. I can see the east fence needs repair. I noticed your barn roof has a section that is not going to survive another serious rain, and your water channel from the well to the livestock trough is not running efficiently." Alberta looked at him. "What makes you think I need your help?" "I do not think you need it," he said carefully. "I think it would be faster with 2 people, and I owe you something for the doctoring." She considered this. She was behind on the fence. The barn roof was a genuine concern, and there was something about the direct, undramatic way he made his offer that she found she could not easily refuse. 2 weeks, she said. "I will feed you. You can sleep in the barn." "That is fair," he said. He moved into the barn that evening, making himself a bed in the clean hay above the stalls with a quiet competence that suggested he had done this before, that he was accustomed to fitting himself into small corners of other people's spaces without displacing anything. Alberta watched him from the doorway of the house without knowing quite why, and then she went inside and told herself it was strictly a practical arrangement. He worked hard. That was the first thing she registered with the kind of appreciation that had nothing sentimental in it. He was at the fence on the east pasture before she was up in the morning, and she found his breakfast plate clean and set beside the basin when she came down, having apparently cooked for himself without disturbing her. He took direction well, asked intelligent questions, and did not feel the need to offer her opinions about how she ran her operation. He was exactly the kind of help she had not let herself admit she needed, and she resented this slightly. What she did not register for several days, because she was not looking for it, was that he was also leaving before she woke every morning. She slept lightly, always had, and yet for that first stretch of days something about the predawn hour kept pulling her under, kept her asleep while the sky was still that deep blue-black between night and dawn. She only became aware of the pattern when one morning she woke at what she judged to be about 4 in the morning, driven by the sound of coyotes at the edge of the north pasture, and she lay in the dark listening to them fade, and suddenly she heard, with perfect clarity, the soft sound of the barn door opening and closing. She lay very still for a moment, listening. There were no other sounds, no footsteps across the yard, just that one quiet movement and then silence. She got up and went to her window. The barn door was closed. The yard was empty under a half moon. Nothing moved. She went back to bed and lay there thinking about it, and she did not sleep again until the sky was beginning to lighten, and by then she had told herself she had simply misheard something. But the next morning she woke in the ordinary way, to the full dawn light and the smell of coffee, and she went downstairs and found his breakfast plate clean and set aside. And when she looked out the window, he was already at the barn with the horses. And the morning after that she set her will again sleep at 4 o'clock and lay with her eyes open in the dark, and she heard it again. The barn door, then nothing. She rose this time and went to the window fast enough to see him crossing the yard in the pale dark, moving without a lantern, heading toward the creek that ran along the south edge of her property. She watched him until the darkness took him, and then she stood there with her arms crossed, thinking. He was back before full light always. She knew because she watched for him from the window in the mornings that followed. He would go to the creek at that predawn hour, spend perhaps 20 or 30 minutes there and come back. He always came back before the ranch needed him, before the day properly started, and if she had not been a woman accustomed to waking with purpose, she would never have known. She did not ask him about it. She told herself it was none of her business, that whatever a grown man did in the private hours of the early morning was his own concern, and that she was not curious, not particularly. She was very curious. She was also, and she noticed this with some alarm, starting to look forward to breakfast. Not to the food exactly, though he had proven himself a better camp cook than Gerald had ever been, but to the particular quality of the mornings when he was present. He was good company in a way that did not demand anything of her. He talked when talk was natural and was quiet when quiet was better, and he listened with his whole attention when she spoke, which was something she had not realized she had been missing until she had it again. She showed him more of the operation than she had intended to. She took him through her breeding records, the careful journal she kept in a ledger, noting the lines and the qualities of each animal. He looked through it with genuine interest, asking questions that demonstrated he understood what he was reading, and she found herself talking for an hour before she pulled herself back to the awareness that she was doing it. The 2 weeks became 3, and she did not comment on this, and he did not either. One evening in the 3rd week, she was mending harness leather by lamplight on the porch when he came up from the barn and sat on the step below her without invitation, looking out at the evening sky, which was putting on one of its spectacular displays of rose and gold above the flat, dark line of the mesa. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She kept her eyes on her work. "You can ask." "Why did you take me in? You had no reason to trust me. You live alone out here." She thought about this honestly before she answered. "Because the quality of your grown was genuine," she said. A moment of silence. "That is a very specific reason." "I am a very specific person." She set down the harness and looked at the sky. Also, you were clearly not going to survive leaving, and I could not think of a good reason to let a man die on my porch over pure caution. Some people could think of several reasons. I am not most people. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said with a simplicity that caught her off guard. You are not. She did not look at him. She picked up the harness again and pulled her needle through the leather. Those mornings, she said before she had decided to. When you go to the creek, what do you do there? He went very still for a moment, the way a man does when he is deciding how much of himself to offer. Then he said, I go and sit by the water. I have done it since I was a boy. Early mornings always felt like they belonged to me in a way the rest of the day did not. In Texas, it was a river. Up north, it was whatever water was nearby. He paused. I did not mean to be mysterious about it. It is just habit. Does it help something? She asked quietly. He considered this. It helps me feel like myself, he said, before the day makes its demands. Alberta understood this in a way that went deeper than she expected, because she had her own version of it. The half hour each evening when she sat on this porch and watched the sky and let the day drain off her before she went inside. She had never told anyone about this because she had never thought it needed telling, but suddenly the parallel was vivid and slightly disorienting. That makes sense, she said, and she meant it. He looked at her then, and she felt the weight of his attention without meeting it. How long has it been since someone shared your mornings? He asked, and the question was so precisely aimed at the thing she kept locked away that she felt it land. Gerald did not keep early hours, she said, which was the sideways truth of it. Gerald had been a man of noon and mid-afternoon, full of plans that expanded in the evening and contracted by morning. She had loved him in the beginning, for his warmth and his laughter, and she had learned over 5 years of marriage that warmth and laughter could not fill every kind of space. Calvin did not press further. He simply nodded and looked back out at the dark coming in from the east, and they sat in companionable silence until the stars were fully up. The next morning, she rose at 4 o'clock deliberately, and she wrapped herself in her heaviest shawl and walked down to the creek in the dark. He was already there, sitting on the flat rock above the bank, looking at the water. The creek was low this time of year, but it ran clear and it talked to itself over the stones, and above it the sky was still dark and full of stars. He heard her coming because she did not try to be quiet, and he turned and looked at her with an expression she could not fully read in the dark. She sat down on the rock beside him without asking, leaving a careful distance between them, and she looked at the water. I thought I would see what the fuss was about, she said. He turned back to the creek. After a moment, she felt him relax beside her, the slight releasing of tension in his shoulders. They sat there for perhaps half an hour without speaking more than a handful of sentences, and it was the most peaceful Alberta had felt in longer than she could precisely calculate. When the sky began to lighten in the east, she stood and he stood beside her, and they walked back to the ranch together in the gray predawn, and she thought that this was either very simple or very complicated, and she could not decide which. After that she came some mornings and not others, and he was always there when she came, sitting in exactly the same place, and he never indicated that her presence was anything other than natural. He never angled for more of her. He simply made room. This, she would think later, was what undid her most completely. Not his looks, though she had privately acknowledged he was the kind of man who could be called handsome with no exaggeration. Not his competence, though she valued it genuinely. It was the fact that he made room for her without requiring her to change shape. In early May, a situation arose that changed the texture of things. She needed to go to Red Rock Crossing for supplies, a 2-hour ride and a half-day of business, and she had planned to go on a Thursday. On Wednesday evening, a man rode onto her property, a large and florid individual named Bert Hackett, who had been sending her offers for her land since Gerald's death, and who she had refused with increasing directness each time. She was in the corral when he rode up, and she came to the fence and watched him dismount with the expression of a woman who has run out of patience and is not pretending otherwise. "Miss Thatcher," he said, tipping his hat with an elaborate courtesy she despised. He had always called her Miss Thatcher, as though the widowhood diminished her more than the marriage had. "Mr. Hackett," she said, "I am busy. I will not take much of your time." He looked around the property with the hungry appraisal she knew well. "I am prepared to offer you $600 for the ranch and all improvements. That is a generous offer, Miss Thatcher, given the current market." "The answer is no," she said, "as it was the last 4 times. You are a woman alone out here. Running a horse operation is difficult work for what?" she said, and her voice carried a specific quality of warning that any reasonable person would have heeded. Hackett was not a reasonable person. "A woman," he said, finishing his sentence with a smile that had something unpleasant in its corners. She heard the barn door, and then Calvin was there at the edge of the corral, not aggressive, not threatening, simply present, standing with the easy stillness of a man who is entirely comfortable and not in any hurry. Hackett's eyes went to him, and something recalculated behind his expression. "My associate," Alberta said crisply, because it was the simplest true thing she could say. "He has very good hearing." Hackett looked at Calvin for a moment longer than was comfortable, then back at Alberta. "I will leave my offer open," he said, and mounted and rode out with more speed than dignity. Alberta turned back to the corral. Calvin came and stood at the fence beside her. "How long has he been at you about this property?" he asked. "Since the week after Gerald's funeral," she said, with a flatness that contained a great deal of compressed anger. "He is not the kind who gives up." "No," she agreed. "But I am also not the kind who gives in." She glanced at him. "Thank you for coming out." "I came out to let the bay mare have her evening air," he said. "That was what I was doing." She looked at him for a moment, reading the slight emphasis he had placed on the last sentence. He was giving her the version of events that cost her nothing, that required no gratitude or acknowledgement of vulnerability, and she understood exactly what he was doing. "Of course," she said, and went back to work. That night she sat longer than usual on the porch, and when she went inside she found she was thinking about Calvin Rourke in a way that had begun to exceed what was purely practical. She identified this with some precision, because she was a woman who preferred to know what was happening inside herself even when she did not like it. She was falling in love with him. Not the swooning, sudden variety she had read about in the ladies' periodicals that arrived months late at the Redrock Crossing Mercantile. Something slower and more serious, like the way a creek carves a canyon, not dramatically but with complete thoroughness. She lay in the dark and applied every rational argument she possessed. He was a drifting man. He had told her plainly that he had spent 10 years moving from one place and one outfit to another. He had no property, no fixed employment, no evident plan for roots. He was staying because she had given him honest work and he had a debt to pay, and when the debt was settled, he would move on to the next place and the next job, and this was simply the nature of a certain kind of man in the territory. She was a woman with a ranch to run and a reputation to maintain, and entirely too much invested in this piece of ground to be unsteady about it. She talked herself into a practical acceptance of all of this and went asleep. She was at the creek the next morning. He was there, as he always was, and they sat together in the predawn dark and watched the water and did not say much. After a while he spoke, looking at the stars still visible in the west. "I have been thinking about staying," he said. Alberta's heart performed a movement that she kept very carefully off her face. "Staying," she repeated. "There is good work here. The operation you are building is worth building." He paused. "If you need an extra hand on a permanent basis, I would consider it fair work for fair pay." She looked at the water. "You are a drifting man, Calvin Rourke." "I have been a drifting man," he said, and the distinction was deliberate. "That does not mean it is the only thing I know how to be." She wanted to ask him why here, why now, and she also knew that asking it would be asking him to say more than either of them was ready for, and so she said instead, "I cannot pay you a great deal." "I know what you can pay," he said. "I have been here long enough to understand the accounts. It is enough." She looked at him then, and he met her eyes, and in the slow brightening of the sky between them, something was acknowledged without being named, and this felt appropriate and also terrifying. "Then I suppose you had better stay," she said. He nodded once and looked back at the water, and she could see, in the growing light, that something had settled in him. Some quality of tension she had taken for his baseline suddenly absent, and she understood that he had been more uncertain than he had allowed her to see. The weeks that followed had a different quality, a permanence in the shape of the days that she felt in small ways. He began keeping a few personal effects in the barn, not many: a second pair of shirts, a shaving kit, a small collection of books that surprised her because she had not thought of him as a reading man, and she revised this assessment of herself. She found him one afternoon with what appeared to be a letter, though she did not see the contents, and he folded it and put it in his coat when he heard her coming, and she chose not to remark on it, because everyone deserved their private correspondences. She found out about the letter eventually, but not yet. In June, a man named Thomas Ely came through Reed Rock Crossing as the new reservation school teacher, and his wife brought him, and they stayed at the boarding house in town. And Alberta met them when she brought a delivery of horses to Fort Selden and stopped in Reed Rock Crossing on the way back. Mary Ely was a pleasant woman who talked with considerable enthusiasm about her hopes for the territory, and she looked at Alberta with the frank interest of someone who sees a puzzle worth solving. "Are you quite alone out at your ranch?" Mary asked, over coffee at the small house behind the boarding house where the Elys were temporarily kept. "I have hired help," Alberta said. "A man?" Mary asked, with the particular directness of a woman who does not see the point of indirection. "Yes," Alberta said. Mary's eyes were bright. "Is he a decent man?" Alberta thought about this. "He is," she said. "He is one of the decent ones." Mary smiled, and Alberta looked away. She had occasion to think about that conversation 2 weeks later when Calvin came in from the east pasture in the early afternoon, with a look on his face that was working to stay neutral and not entirely succeeding. "There is a letter for you from the bank in Santa Fe," he said, handing it over. He had picked up her mail when he went to town for fencing supplies that morning. "I did not read it." She took it, and her stomach went still and cold in the way it did whenever anything arrived from Santa Fe. She opened it at the kitchen table, and Calvin stood at the doorway, not intruding but not leaving either. The news was not catastrophic, but it was not good. Gerald's creditors had sold the debt to a new party, a land speculator in Albuquerque named Henderson, and Henderson was initiating a formal review of the debt terms, which could result in an accelerated payment schedule. In plain terms, it meant she might owe $240 within the next 8 months rather than the 4-year arrangement she had been managing. She set the letter down and looked at the table for a moment. "Bad?" Calvin asked. "Complicated," she said, and told him the outline of it. He came fully into the kitchen and sat down across from her, and she found she did not mind this, found in fact that she was relieved to not have to sit with it alone. She had been sitting with things alone for 2 years, and it was exhausting in ways she had stopped letting herself notice. "What are your horses worth right now?" he asked. They spent the next hour going through the ledger together, calculating. He was good with figures, precise and unsentimental, and by the end of the hour they had identified 3 animals she could sell without compromising her breeding stock, and if she brought them to the army post at Fort Selden herself rather than through the trader in town, she would get better prices. "That gets you to 180, he said. "The gap is $60. She nodded. "I will manage the 60. He looked at her steadily. "I have $60, he said. She looked up at him sharply. "No, it is not a gift, it is a loan, and I have no use for it sitting in my boot." "You keep your wages in your boot." "I keep everything I have in my boot," he said without embarrassment. "I have been a drifting man, as you observed. I have not had occasion for a bank account." She looked at him for a long moment. "I will not take charity, Calvin." "It is not charity," he said. "It is $60 between a woman I respect and a land speculator in Albuquerque. I know which side of that I stand on." She looked at the ledger and at the letter and at his face, and she said, more quietly, "Why?" He met her eyes and held them, and for once he did not look away or take the easiest answer available. "Because you matter to me," he said, "and that is about as plainly as I am able to say it." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, one of the horses moved in the corral, and the sound of it was the only thing in the world for a moment. "I will pay you back," she said, which was not answering what he had said, and they both knew it. But he accepted it with a slight nod, and she accepted that they had each said and heard something real, and that was enough for now. She went to Fort Selden the following week with 3 horses, and came back with more money than she had expected, because the post quartermaster was a good judge of horseflesh and recognized quality, and the payment crisis was resolved by the end of August, including Calvin's $60, which she paid back in full on a Friday afternoon, counting it into his hand. He looked at the money and then at her. "You did not need to do it this fast. I told you I would pay you back," she said. "I do not say things I do not mean." He closed his hand around the coins and looked at her with something open in his expression that she had not seen there before, a kind of unguarded warmth that was not performing anything, not asking anything, just present. "I know that," he said. "That is one of the things about you." She became aware that they were standing very close, that the transaction had closed the distance between them in the ordinary practical way of handing over money, and that she had not stepped back and neither had he. She could see the fine detail of his face, the scar on his chin that she had never asked about, the way his eyes had small gold threads in the dark brown when the light hit them directly. She stepped back. She turned toward the house. She said, "I am making supper," and walked away from him, and she spent the next hour being very deliberate about the preparation of a chicken that had done nothing to deserve the ferocity with which she plucked it. He came in for supper as he had every evening since his arrival, sitting at the end of the kitchen table with the quiet assumption of a place that had become natural, and she put food in front of him and sat across from him, and they ate, and talked about the horses, and about a letter she had received from her sister in Denver, and about the fact that it appeared Red Rock Crossing was getting a telegraph line by the winter, and it was all very ordinary, and she was completely undone. She had loved Gerald. She wanted to be honest with herself about this. She had loved him with the genuine feeling of a 20-year-old woman who had found a man who made her laugh and who had a dream she could believe in. That love had complicated itself as she learned his flaws and as the dream eroded, but it had been real. What she felt for Calvin Rourke was different in the way that a river is different from a rain shower, not better necessarily, but wider and steadier and more thoroughgoing, and it frightened her precisely because of how substantial it was. After supper he stayed a few minutes longer than usual, turning his coffee cup in his hands, and finally he said, "There is something I would like to say, if you are willing to hear it." She folded her hands on the table. "Say it." He was looking at the coffee cup, then he made himself look up. "I know I am a man without a great deal to offer in the way of property or establishment. I know you have built what you have here through your own work and your own determination, and I have no wish to imply that you need anything from me to continue doing that." He paused, gathering the words with the care of a man who does not speak carelessly. "I have been at this ranch for 4 months, which is longer than I have stayed anywhere in a great number of years. I want you to know that this is not coincidence. It is not purely the quality of the work, though the work is good. It is—" He stopped. "It is me," she said quietly. He met her eyes. "Yes." She sat with this for a moment, and he let her, not filling the silence with anything. "I am afraid of it," she said, because he deserved the truth of her. "I am afraid of caring about someone who leaves. Gerald left in the way of dying, which was not his choice, but I have been alone since, and I have made myself capable of that, and I do not—" She stopped, reorganizing. "I do not want to build something in myself and have it taken apart again." "That is a fair thing to be afraid of," he said. "Are you planning on leaving?" she asked, and the question came out more direct and more raw than she had intended. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and the warmth of it was startling. "I plan on staying," he said. "Not because you need me to, but because this is where I want to be. That is the truth, Alberta, and I am not a man who says things lightly. She looked at his hand on hers, and she thought of all the mornings at the creek, and the way he had held still for her stitching, and the way he had made room for her without demanding she fill it, and the $60 in his boot, and the way he looked at the horses, and the way he looked at her, and she turned her hand over and held his. "Then you will stay," she said, and this was both a statement and a question and an answer all at once. "Yes," he said. She looked at him across the table in the lamplight. "I am going to need you to be very patient with me," she said. "I am not easy, and I know this about myself." The corner of his mouth moved. "I have noticed," he said, "and I have not yet considered leaving." She almost laughed. It was the closest she had come to laughing genuinely in a long time, and she could feel it in her chest, warm and slightly terrifying. She did not let go of his hand for a while. The change between them was not sudden, which suited Alberta, who distrusted sudden things. It was gradual and substantial, like the way the light changes across a mesa as a day progresses. Not a single dramatic shift, but a continuous becoming. They were not public about it in the beginning, not because either of them was ashamed, but because neither of them was the performing type, and Reed Rock Crossing was a small town with considerable appetite for other people's arrangements. What they were was simply present with each other in a way that was different from before, a quality of awareness that was warm rather than guarded. He still went to the creek at 4 in the morning, but now she came more often than not, and they had developed a vocabulary of silence that was its own kind of intimacy, knowing when to speak and when to simply be. One morning in late August, when the sky above the mesa was turning the color of a new bruise from the east, she said, "Tell me about your family." He told her about his mother first, a woman of strong opinions and considerable competence whom he clearly admired deeply. He told her about his brothers, who had stayed in Texas and were doing well enough. He told her about the ranch he had grown up on, the particular way the Texas hill country looked in the spring, and she listened and asked questions when she had them and let him be as complete or as spare as he wanted. "Do you miss it?" she asked. He thought about this carefully. "I miss my mother," he said. "The place I miss sometimes, but the missing is not heavy. I have been away long enough that the territory feels more like mine than Texas does." He looked at the creek. "This creek feels like mine." She looked at the creek too. "You know what you told me that first night on the porch," she said, "about the widow Munez, the man who was taking her horse." "Yes." "Was that where you had come from when I found you, 12 miles north?" "I had been up that way, yes. I had run across Mrs. Munez at the trading post in the valley the week before. She had mentioned the situation and I had gone back to help if I could." He paused. "It did not go entirely smoothly." "It landed you on my porch," she said. "Yes." "Have you checked on her since?" He looked at her. "I have not had occasion to ride that far." "We should go," Alberta said. "I would like to see that she is all right and that the man has not come back." He was quiet for a moment. "We," he said, and the single word carried a weight she heard clearly. "If you are a man who plans to stay," she said, "then things become we." "Yes," he said, with a satisfaction that was quiet and complete. "They do." They rode north 2 days later on a clear morning and found Dolores Munez in good order, running a small but tidy homestead with her 2 boys and the draft horse still in the corral, large and healthy. The man who had threatened her had apparently moved on after the encounter with Calvin. Dolores was a small, composed woman in her mid-30s with an independence about her that Alberta recognized and respected, and she received them warmly and served coffee and corn tortillas, and told Calvin with no particular sentiment that she was glad he was alive, because she had heard he had been hurt and had not known how badly. "Your neighbor looked after me," Calvin said, with a glance at Alberta that Dolores caught and noted with a small smile she did not make obvious. On the ride back, Alberta felt something settle in her that she could not entirely name. The sense of having gone somewhere and come back together, of having been a pair in the world rather than a solitary unit. She said after a while, "I want to tell you something." He rode beside her and waited. "I am not an easy person," she said. "I have already told you this, but I want to be specific about why." She kept her eyes on the trail ahead. "Gerald was a kind man, and I believe he loved me as well as he was capable, but he did not take me seriously. Not my opinions about the ranch, not my capacity for hard decisions, not my sense of what was real. He was a man who thought warmth was enough, and he was not entirely wrong, but warmth that does not include respect is not quite complete." She paused. "I am telling you this because you have never made me feel that way. Not once in all these months. And I notice it, and I am grateful for it, and I wanted you to know." He was quiet for a long stride of the horses. "Your competence is one of the most impressive things I have ever witnessed," he said. "I would not diminish it for anything in the world. It would be like trying to diminish the mesa. It would simply say something poor about the one doing the diminishing." She looked at him. He was looking at the trail, which gave her a moment to look at him fully, and she thought that whatever happened from here, she was glad she had found him on her porch, and she was glad she had dragged him inside. September brought a complication in the form of Calvin's letter. She found out about it on a Thursday evening when he came in from the barn with a look on his face that she recognized as the look of a man who has decided to tell the truth about something he has been carrying. He sat down at the kitchen table and she sat across from him, and he said, "I want to tell you about something." She waited. "I have a daughter," he said. "She is 5 years old. Her name is Ruth. Her mother was a woman I knew in Texas 7 years ago. We were not married. She married another man a year after Ruth was born, a good man who has been a proper father to her. I have no claim on Ruth and no wish to disrupt what she has." He kept his eyes on the table. "But I correspond with her mother so that I know Ruth is well. The letters are purely about the child. The marriage is a solid one, and I want nothing from it but the knowledge that my daughter is healthy." Alberta looked at him for a long moment. "How is she?" Alberta asked. He looked up. Something in him had been braced for a different response. "She is well. She is apparently very stubborn and very good with animals. She takes after her father," Alberta said, "on at least one count." He looked at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize, something between relief and gratitude, and a deeper emotion she did not want to name for him. "You are not," he started. "You have no dishonest history," she said. "You were young, circumstances happened as circumstances do. You have behaved as responsibly as the situation allowed. I have no objection to raise." She folded her hands on the table. "I would like you to know, however, that if we are going to be honest with each other, I prefer all of it, not just the portions that are easy to share." "That is fair," he said. "Is there anything else?" She asked, not with accusation but with the open directness of a woman who wanted the full account. He thought about this seriously. "No, that is the whole of it." "Good," she said, and got up to put the kettle on. He watched her from the table, and she could feel it, the weight and warmth of his attention, and she let it land without flinching. October came in cool and smelling of dust and the last of the summer, and with it came a change that Alberta had not entirely predicted. She was in the barn one evening past sunset, doing a final check on a mare who was close to foaling, when he came in with a lantern and set it on the hook and came to stand beside her at the stall. "She is not tonight," Alberta said, examining the mare's condition. "Tomorrow, maybe the day after." He stood beside her and they looked at the mare together in the warm lamplight. "Alberta," he said. "Calvin," she said without looking at him, and there was something in the mutual use of names that was deliberate and settled. "I love you," he said. She looked up at him then. He was looking at her with complete steadiness, the way he looked at everything he was certain about, with no performance and no decoration, just the plain fact of it. She had known this was coming and had still not quite prepared for the specific quality of hearing it said aloud. It went through her like water through dry earth, straight down and deep and completely absorbed. "I know," she said quietly. Then, because he deserved the equal return of it, "I love you too. I have for some time, and I have been unreasonably slow about admitting it." He reached up and took her face in his hands with a gentleness that was at odds with the size and roughness of them, and she put her hands against his chest, and let herself be held for a moment in the flickering lantern light, with the mare moving softly behind them, and the night coming down outside, and the sound of the creek distant in the dark. He kissed her, and it was careful and warm and unhurried, and then she kissed him back with more conviction, and he responded in kind, and the mare stamped once, and they both pulled back slightly and looked at each other. Alberta laughed. The real laugh, the one she had been holding back since July, warm and genuine and slightly helpless, and he watched it with an expression of such undisguised affection that she had to look away for a moment. "The mare needs her rest," she said. "She does," he agreed. They walked out of the barn together into the clear, dark night, and she took his hand, which was something she had not done before in the open air of her own property, and he held it as though it were entirely natural. They stood in the yard looking up at the stars, which in the New Mexico territory in October were extraordinary, thick and cold and impossibly present. "I want to marry you," he said, looking up. She looked up too. "I know that also," she said. "Is that a yes?" She looked at him. "It is not a no," she said. "Give me until spring, let me be sure." He nodded. "Until spring," he said. She turned back to the stars. "But for what it is worth," she added, "I believe the answer will be yes." He squeezed her hand once, and she felt it through her whole body, and they stood there a while longer under the cold glory of the October sky. The winter of 1874 moving into 1875 was a hard one in Red Rock Crossing. 3 weeks of cold that bit deeper than usual, snow twice from the north, and a stretch of frozen mornings that made the water troughs solid by dawn. Alberta and Calvin worked the ranch through it with an efficiency born of genuine partnership, neither of them inclined to drama, both of them inclined to simply doing what the day required. He moved into the house in December. This happened in the matter-of-fact way that things between them tended to happen, without announcement or ceremony. A cold snap made the barn genuinely dangerous for sleeping, and she said, "You can have the back room." And he moved his few things inside, and the following week the back room door stayed open, and a week after that it was not a separate arrangement anymore. Red Rock Crossing, as small towns do, arrived at its own understanding of the situation. There was some discussion, as there always was, and some of it was unkind, in the way that people sometimes treated widows who found their feet again, as though their self-sufficiency were somehow a reproach. Mary Ely, whose opinion Alberta had come to value, told her bluntly that anyone with eyes could see the man was devoted and the ranch was prospering, and the people with something to say about it were in the minority. Bert Hackett stopped riding out to make offers in January, which Alberta attributed to a combination of factors including Calvin's continued visible presence on the property, and a rumor she heard from the mercantile owner's wife that Hackett's own financial situation had become complicated. She wished him no specific harm, but registered his absence with satisfaction. In February, on a morning when the snow was thin on the ground and the creek ran low and dark under a pale sky, Alberta sat on the flat rock above the bank beside Calvin in the early predawn, and she said, "Yes." He turned to look at her. "The answer to your question from October," she said. "Yes." "I have been sure for some time, actually. I simply wanted to keep my word about waiting until spring, and then I decided that February is close enough." He looked at her in the early gray light, and she looked back. "Are you certain?" he asked, not doubting her but giving her the full consideration of the question. "I am certain that you are the best man I know," she said. "I am certain that you have never once made me feel small or incapable or unnecessary. I am certain that you love me in a way that makes room for everything I actually am, and not just the convenient parts." She paused. "I am certain that I want to wake up next to you for as long as I am given, and that the ranch is better with you in it, and that I am better with you in it, though that is the harder thing to admit." "That was not so hard," he said. "It was harder than it looked," she told him. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they watched the light come up over the mesa, the way they had watched it dozens of times now, and it was the same and entirely different, as things become when they are finally named. They were married in March on a Thursday in the Redrock Crossing Courthouse, with Mary and Thomas Ely as witnesses and the courthouse clerk as officiant. Alberta wore her good dark blue dress and Calvin wore a coat she had not seen before, well cut and apparently preserved for occasions, and she looked at him in it and revised her already considerable opinion of him upward in ways she kept to herself. The clerk was a man named Potts who had married perhaps 300 couples in his tenure and had the ceremony down to a practiced brevity that suited both Alberta and Calvin perfectly. When it was done and the papers were signed, Mary Ely cried with a thoroughness that was deeply felt, and Alberta shook her hand and hugged her, which was not a thing Alberta did casually with anyone. They rode back to the ranch in the clear, cool afternoon, and he held her hand on the seat of the wagon, and the horses moved at their usual good pace, and the mesa stood golden in the March light, and she felt the particular quality of a thing completed, a door closed on one kind of life and opened onto another. "Happy?" he said. "Yes," she said, without qualification or complication. "You?" "I am," he said, and it was the simplest and most complete answer she had ever heard. The spring of 1875 was gentler than the winter that preceded it, and the ranch came back to life in the particular way of that country, tentative at first, and then with a sudden abundance that was startling. The mare's foal and Alberta's breeding records proved out beautifully, the lines she had been developing for 3 years producing animals with the conformation and temperament she had been working toward. Calvin had become genuinely useful with the horses in ways that went beyond labor, having a patience with the young ones and a reading of their behavior that she respected. She let him work with the roan gelding she had been training the previous spring, the one he had first watched her work from the fence, and he brought it along with a quiet steadiness that produced results she would not have predicted in the time he took to do it. He did not try to replicate what she did. He developed his own method, which was different and effective in different ways, and she found this admirable. They had their first serious disagreement in April. It was about money, specifically about Calvin's suggestion that they take on a loan to expand the breeding stock by purchasing 2 mares from a ranch in Arizona Territory that were of exceptional quality. Alberta's instinct was against debt, always, an instinct honed by Gerald's habits and by her experience with the bank in Santa Fe. Calvin's argument was that the opportunity was specific and time-limited, and the quality of the animals would advance their program by 2 years at minimum. They argued about this with the full force of 2 strong-minded people who each had legitimate points, and it went around several times before Alberta said, with some heat, "I know what debt looks like, Calvin. I have lived inside it." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him choosing his next words carefully. "I know that," he said, "and I am not dismissing what that cost you. I am asking you to look at this particular situation on its own terms, not through the lens of what Gerald did. They are not the same thing." She stood in the kitchen and felt the anger and then felt, underneath it, the recognition that he was right, and that the 2 things were in fact not the same thing. "Give me a day," she said. "Take all the time you need," he said. She went through the accounts that evening and then through them again, and she slept on it, and in the morning she said, "The loan is reasonable if we can arrange terms of not more than 2 years. He looked at her with the expression of a man who is being careful not to be visibly triumphant. "Do not gloat," she told him. "I was not gloating." "You had the expression of a man considering gloating." "I was considering it," he admitted, "and then I thought better of it." "Good," she said. "Write to the ranch in Arizona." The Arizona mares arrived in June, both of them exactly what had been described, and Alberta ran her hands over them with the particular satisfaction of having been wrong about something and then been corrected in a way that turned out well. "You are allowed to say I told you so," she said to Calvin, who was leading the second mare into her stall. "I would never," he said. "You would absolutely," she said. "You are simply choosing not to." He looked at her over the mare's back. "I am learning," he said, and the small smile on his face made her feel warmly unreasonable. In July she discovered she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for 2 full days before she told him, not because she was afraid of his response, but because she wanted to know her own heart fully before she shared the information. Her own heart, she found on examination, was full and a little frightened and predominantly certain that this was right. She and Calvin were building something real, and a child was a piece of that reality, and she was not too old for it, and he was not going anywhere, and the ranch could support it. She told him on a Tuesday evening when supper was done, and the dishes were put away, and they were sitting on the porch in the summer dusk, watching the bats come out over the creek. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. He turned to look at her. His face went through several things in close succession, and she watched them pass, and what landed and stayed was something close to wonder. "When?" he said. "January, I think, maybe February." He reached over and took her hand, and they sat looking at the darkening sky, and after a moment he said, "Are you all right?" "I am perfectly healthy," she said. "That is not entirely what I meant." She looked at him. "I know." She looked back at the sky. "I am good. I am genuinely good. I thought about it for 2 days to make sure, and the answer is that I am glad." He brought her hand up and held it against his jaw for a moment, and she felt the rough of his beard against her knuckles. "I am very glad," he said quietly. The pregnancy was straightforward, which Alberta considered fair compensation for the variety of other difficulties she had navigated. She was sick in the mornings through August and into September, and she resented this with some vigor, but managed it with the same practical competence she brought to everything. Calvin learned to have water and plain crackers within reach before she was fully awake, and he did this without making a ceremony of it, which she appreciated. She kept working for as long as she could, modifying what she did as the pregnancy progressed, letting Calvin take over the riding and the heavier physical work while she concentrated on the breaking of young horses from the fence and the business correspondence and the accounts. She was no less busy, she told him, just differently deployed. He agreed with this assessment. He also watched her with a steady, quiet attention that she had come to understand was his version of care, not hovering or fussing, but simply being present and aware, available without being intrusive. Dolores Munez came south to stay with them in the last month, because Alberta did not want to be far from practical help as the birth approached, and Dolores had brought both of her boys into the world without a physician, and had a competence about it that Alberta respected. The 2 women got along well, with the straightforward directness of women who have each learned to manage difficult circumstances and find in each other a comfortable recognition. Calvin was displaced from the house during Dolores' stay and reverted to the barn with no complaint, appearing for meals and working with equitable good cheer. Alberta noticed that he and Dolores had an easy rapport, the comfortable mutual respect of people who had encountered each other in a moment of consequence and came through it with good opinion of each other. The baby came on a Thursday in February 1876, which struck Alberta as consistent with the family tendency toward Thursdays. He was a boy, and he was large and red-faced and furious about the whole business of being born, and when Dolores put him in Alberta's arms, his fury subsided into a watchful intensity that reminded Alberta startlingly of his father. Calvin came in when Dolores called him. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom looking at the 2 of them on the bed, and Alberta watched his face and saw everything there was to see in it, and she felt a tenderness for him so large it was slightly alarming. "Come in," she said. "Come and meet him." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby into his arms, and the baby looked up at him with the unfocused but urgent attention of the newborn, and Calvin looked down at him with an expression Alberta would carry with her for the rest of her life. "Hello," Calvin said softly to the baby. "He needs a name," Alberta said. "We said we would decide when we saw him." "What do you think?" he asked her. She looked at the baby for a moment. "James," she said. "James Calvin Rourke." He looked at her. "You want to use my name, half of it," she said. "It seems appropriate." He swallowed and looked back at the baby. "James Calvin Rourke," he said, trying it out. The baby made a small sound of indeterminate meaning. "I think he agrees." He agrees with everything right now, Alberta said. Enjoy it, I am told it passes. He laughed, and she laughed with him, and James Calvin Rourke regarded them both with his watchful dark eyes. Redrock Crossing continued its slow transformation through 1876 and into 1877. The telegraph line came as predicted, and with it a slightly faster connection to the larger world. The town grew, 2 new businesses and a proper schoolhouse and an expansion of the boarding house. The Elys remained, Thomas's school a genuine institution now, Mary delivering a daughter of her own in the spring of 1876 and becoming an even firmer friend to Alberta in the process. The ranch grew too. By the end of 1876, Alberta had 32 horses, a number that satisfied her not because it was the most she could manage, but because it was the right size for the quality she wanted to maintain. She sold to the army, to working ranches throughout the valley, and twice to buyers who came all the way from El Paso on the recommendation of the Fort Selden quartermaster, who had become a useful advocate. Calvin was fully her partner in this, not in the romantic abstraction of the word, but in the practical daily reality of it. They made decisions together and disagreed sometimes, and negotiated and landed on things that were usually better than either of their individual first positions. She respected his judgment and told him so, and he respected hers and showed it in the way he operated, which she had come to understand was how he expressed things that mattered. James was a vivid child, as Alberta had known he would be, with his father's dark coloring and her green eyes, an unusual combination that produced a striking result. He was also, by the time he was walking, exactly as stubborn as his mother and as patient as his father, which made for a comprehensive personality. Alberta watched him work at things with the same quiet persistence Calvin brought to everything, and felt something that she recognized as the particular pride of seeing your best self reflected in something you made. There was a matter that resolved itself in the winter of 1876 that Alberta had not expected to trouble her, but did. Bert Hackett, whose financial situation had apparently deteriorated considerably, sold his own land and left the territory, and the news came to Alberta through the ordinary channels of small-town knowledge. She did not feel charitable toward him. She had no reason to, but she did not feel triumphant either. She simply felt the completion of a thing, the closing of a door on a particular kind of threat, and moved on. The letter from Santa Fe that came in the spring of 1877 was different from all the previous letters from Santa Fe, because this one confirmed that the final payment on Gerald's debt had been received, and the account was closed. Alberta stood in the kitchen holding it and read it 3 times to be certain. Calvin was coming in from the barn, and she held it out to him when he came through the door. He read it and looked at her. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he agreed. She took the letter back and folded it and put it in the ledger between the pages where she kept the most important records, and she closed the ledger and put it back on the shelf. "I should like to have a proper dinner tonight," she said. "Something better than what we usually do." "I think that is entirely deserved," he said. "I think so too," she said, and she went to make it. In the evening of that same spring, when James was a year old and staggering around the kitchen floor with the invincible confidence of a child who has not yet learned caution, Alberta sat on the porch with Calvin in the last light, and she felt the specific quality of a life that has found its shape. "I want to tell you something," she said. He turned to look at her. "When I dragged you off my porch and stitched you up," she said, "I told myself it was purely practical, that I could not let a man die there for want of the effort, and that was true as far as it went. But," he said, "but there was something else which I have only recently been able to articulate." She looked at the darkening sky. "I think I recognize something in you, the quality of your groan, as I said, but more than that, the way you were alone in the dark and bleeding and you did not call for help. You just endured it. I knew that quality. I had spent 2 years of my life operating on exactly that principle." She looked at him. "I think I let you in because some part of me understood you before I knew a single thing about you." He sat with this for a moment, giving it the weight it deserved. "I think I stayed," he said, "for the same reason. I woke up in your back room, which smelled of harness leather and the particular soap you use, and I felt, for the first time in years, like I was somewhere specific. Not just a place, but a somewhere." He looked at her. "I have spent a great deal of my life not being anywhere specific. I did not know how much I missed it until I was here." She reached over and took his hand, the way she had taken it in the October dark under the stars, and held it on her knee. James appeared at the door behind them, having pulled himself up the step in the determined way he had, and stood surveying the yard with the expression of a small person who has arrived at a vantage point and finds it satisfactory. "Down," he said, which was his current solution to every situation, meaning that he wanted to go down the porch step and into the yard. "In a moment," Alberta told him. He considered this. He sat down on the step instead, as though he had chosen to do so, and looked at the horses in the corral with the same serious attention his father gave them. "He is going to be a horseman," Calvin said. "He is going to be whatever he decides to be," Alberta said. "But yes, probably also that." Calvin squeezed her hand. The last of the light was going from the sky, the mesa going dark against the first stars. James said something to himself in the private language of the very young, and the horses moved gently in the corral, and the creek ran in the distance with its quiet voice. She had not expected this. She had expected, after Gerald, after the debts and the losses and the 2 years of grinding solo work, that what she was building was a life in which she was sufficient to herself, because she had to be. She had made herself capable of everything, and had told herself that capability was its own reward. She had not been entirely wrong. The capability had saved her. But Calvin had shown her, not by insisting on it but simply by being beside her, that sufficiency and sharing were not mutually exclusive, that you could be capable and still be held, that strength did not require you to be alone inside it. She thought about the mornings at the creek, those first weeks when she had watched him go in the predawn dark and said nothing, and how much that silence had cost her curiosity, and how the morning she had simply followed him had changed something irreversible. She thought about the morning he had stayed in bed, lying beside her in the gray light, and she had woken first and turned and looked at him sleeping, which was a thing she had not watched him do before. She had lain there looking at his face in the early light, at the lines of it, the scar on his chin, the way sleep made him younger and more unguarded, and she had understood then with complete finality that this was the person she wanted to wake beside for the rest of her life. When he woke and found her watching him, he had not been startled or embarrassed. He had looked back at her with those dark eyes, steady and warm. "You are still here," she had said, and there was more than one meaning in it. "I am staying," he had said, and there was more than one meaning in that too. Everything had changed then, in the quiet of that one ordinary morning that turned out to be anything but. She was thinking about all of this, sitting on the porch in the early dark, and she said, "Thank you for staying." He knew what she meant, the full range of it, not just the morning or the months or the years, but the whole accumulated weight of his decision to be present, fully and completely, in a life that was now also his. "Thank you for letting me in," he said. "In the specific literal sense, from the porch." She smiled. "I almost stepped over you. I am glad you did not." "So am I," she said. Genuinely. James had fallen asleep on the porch step, which was a thing he managed to do anywhere, with the complete trusting ease of a child who has never had reason to be anxious about whether someone will be there when he wakes. Alberta looked at him and felt the warmth of that, the inheritance of security they were giving him, the thing she had not expected to be able to pass on. Calvin stood and lifted him gently, and James did not stir, and Calvin carried him inside, and Alberta followed, and she pulled the blanket up around the sleeping boy in his small bed and stood looking at him for a moment. Then she went back to the kitchen and Calvin was there, and she stood in the middle of the room and looked at him with the full confidence of a woman who knows exactly where she is and who she is with. "What were you thinking about on the porch?" he asked. "All of it," she said. "From the beginning." He came and stood close to her, and she put her hand against his chest, feeling the steady beat beneath it. "Good memories," he said. "Mostly," she said. The parts that were not good led to the parts that are. So I cannot regret any of it." He kissed her forehead, then her temple, then the corner of her mouth, the way he did when he was being careful and deliberate about it, giving her the full attention of each small thing. "I love you, Alberta Rourke," he said, and she had been Alberta Rourke for over a year now, and it still landed fresh every time he said it. "I love you, Calvin Rourke," she said, because she had never had any difficulty saying the true thing once she was sure of it. The year moved forward the way years do when they are good ones, not without difficulty, but with the underlying current of rightness that makes difficulty navigable. In the summer of 1877, Alberta's sister came from Denver with her husband and spent 3 weeks at the ranch, and her sister Marjorie, who had always been the more conventional of the two, looked at what Alberta had built and at Calvin and at James and said, on the last evening, that she had not expected Alberta to end up happy, and she was very glad to be wrong. Alberta told her she was welcome on both counts. She discovered she was pregnant again in the autumn of 1877, and this time she told Calvin the same evening she knew it, because she had learned that keeping things was harder than sharing them, and she preferred the sharing. He received the news with the same expression as the first time, wonder with a practical edge. "March again," he said. "Perhaps April this time," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "James is going to be very interested in this." "James is 2 years old," she said. "He does not know what interested means yet." "He will figure it out," Calvin said, which was true of James about most things. The second baby was a girl, born in late March of 1878, which was something Alberta considered fitting given the season. They named her Clara, after Calvin's mother, and she was smaller than James had been but considerably louder about her opinions from the first hour. Alberta looked at her daughter in the lamplight and felt something complete and whole, the circle of it, the family that had not been planned but had assembled itself out of a series of improbable events beginning with a bleeding man on a porch. James regarded Clara with the serious interest of a 2-year-old confronting something novel. He touched her hand with one cautious finger and then looked up at his father. "Baby," he said accurately. "Your sister," Calvin told him. James considered this. He looked at the baby again. He apparently decided it was acceptable and went back to the serious business of his wooden horses, which were his current primary concern. The ranch in the spring of 1878 was the most successful it had been since Alberta had taken it over. 38 horses of consistently high quality, a reputation that extended beyond the territory, 2 Army contracts, and a waiting list for the foals expected in the coming seasons. She stood at the fence of the east pasture on a clear April morning, Clara in her arms and James beside her with his hands on the lowest rail, and Calvin came up from the barn and stood with them and looked at what they had built. The horses moved in the morning light, and the mesa stood golden and permanent beyond them, and the creek ran in its quiet way along the south edge of the property. 38, she said. 39 in another week if the bay comes through on time, he said. She nodded. She had built this from 19 frightened, sick animals and 2 years of solitary, grinding work. She had built it through debt and threat and loneliness, and the particular difficulty of being a woman who was taken seriously by neither the bank, nor the neighbors, nor the man who kept trying to buy her out. She had also built it with Calvin Rourke, who had appeared on her porch like an answer to a question she had stopped asking, and who had made himself essential not by demanding anything, but by offering everything he had and letting her decide what to take. She looked at him standing beside her in the morning light, holding James up on the fence rail so the boy could see the horses better, and she felt the full measure of her life and found it, at last and genuinely, enough. More than enough. It was full to its edges and warm through its whole depth, and it was hers, and his and theirs, and the children running through it would know from their earliest understanding what it looked like when 2 people built something real together. She shifted Clara against her shoulder and leaned slightly into Calvin's side, and he put his arm around her without interrupting James's view of the horses, and the four of them stood in the April morning at the fence of what they had made. The creek ran on. The horses moved. The mesa held its ancient, patient posture against the sky. And Alberta Thatcher, who had decided long ago that she needed no one, and who had been right about everything except that, breathed in the morning and held everything she loved, and was finally, completely, at home. That evening, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet and the last of the day was going from the sky, she and Calvin sat on the porch in the dark as they always did, and she took his hand as she always did, and the stars came up one by one above the mesa. "Same question as always," he said. "Happy," she said. "Entirely." He lifted her hand and held it, and they watched the stars in the great silence of the New Mexico night. And there was nothing between them that was unfinished or unsaid, no space that was empty of what it needed to hold. The creek ran, the horses rested, the children slept, and the two of them sat in the good dark, and it was enough, and it was everything, and it was the life they had made from a bleeding man on a porch and one woman who had enough heart to let him in.